Morning. The third day after Shell. Mevere rested her chin on her hand and watched Tom cook breakfast. It was their routine when she stayed over, but this morning she felt more aware of the coming changes in their lives, and she looked restlessly about his rooms. About half of Tom's things were moved to her place, which gave his rooms a haunted look. Except for the bookshelf and desk he brought from Earth, the little studio had never been very full of anything, and as a tenured professor, she had a nicer location, larger and closer to the commons. She also kept a lot of possessions at the house in town, so while her apartment wasn't as spacious as the married quarters she'd applied for, there was more room than if they were her sole home. Even with the two of them together, they'd barely feel cramped. Mostly. Hopefully Leia would pack away the last of Chandra's things soon, but it wouldn't matter until school broke for the season. It wasn't something she felt like pressing Leia over either. They spoke every evening, and Leia seemed excited about being together as a family. She spoke of little else and seemed motivated, though she peppered their conversations with questions about Solani. Their call last night had left her in a contemplative mood. The idea of packing off the last of Chandra's things made her feel his loss, but Leia didn't seem to mind. While Miv looked forward to seeing the house in town filled with life again, she'd had a moment of sharp irritation before realizing she was being unfair. Leia had lived alone in a house full of ghosts for years now. If she didn't seem upset, she'd earned the right. That meant plenty of room for Tom, though some of it would need consideration. Here on campus, there was plenty of room in the bedroom closet. After all these months, he still owned next to nothing in the way of clothing. Sometimes she despaired of his disregard for his appearance outside the classroom. The desk and bookcase would find their way over. For all she knew, housing might come up with a couple's unit before the stevedores got around to moving them. That left his collection of human foods crammed into every nook and cranny of his kitchen, but she had the room. She ate sparingly and had never been any kind of cook. The kitchen had been Chandra's domain, so they make do. There would be the joy of letting Tom redecorate his own room, a place here on Shil he could make fully his own. And while Tom wasn't like a Shilvanti man, she'd seen his home on Earth, and the evidence was all around her, from the few pictures to the sparse mementos. He needed somewhere to feel permanent and settle in properly. Her mood wasn't resolved, but perhaps that was why she noticed Tom singing. Usually he hummed whatever melody was playing through his head, but not today, and she listened a while before pulling up the translator on her underpad. Till all the sea's gone dry, my dear, and the rocks melt with the sun. Or I will love thee still, my dear, till the sands of time had run. She smiled as she read the lyrics, but it still marked a difference in their routine, and she wondered if he was feeling the press of change as much as she was. Tom, why didn't you sing more? You have a good voice. Tom broke from his melody, though he kept working at the skillet. He'd made a large stack of biscuits and was working on the concoction of meaty sauce he called gravy. It looked truly awful, but the taste was delicious, and she gave him a thoughtful smile as she deliberately stole a biscuit from the top of the platter. I like to sing when no one's around, but I sound like Mike Knopfler. He sighed, then looked back over his shoulder. Great musician and songwriter, but not much vocal range. My father could sing, but that's my voice in a nutshell. She considered him briefly. As much as she'd missed starting the day with family, Tom enjoyed their mornings even more. She decided it was probably because she'd had Leia, while he'd had no one. The thought was irritating, even as his willingness to sing openly intrigued her. It felt like part of him opening up. Another layer of old drainage and lingering self-doubt falling away. So why the sigh? She stalled, finishing off the biscuit as she mulled it over. She cocked her head to one side, picking a plover from the basket. It might be nothing, but she'd been chasing her thoughts around and now seemed a good time to dive in. Is something bothering you? Sort of. Like of the calm before the storm? Tom paused in stirring the gravy, but the set of his shoulders changed. There's just a lot to do. I still haven't managed to meet with this priest. The whole thing about this coming shell has me worried. And on top of it all, there's the damned IOTC class. What's up with that? The Navy and Marine attachments on campus are small, but they have officers. How do professors get landed with this? Mevere unpacked that as she picked at the plover. Tom had explained the planned visit to the Northern Palace, and she was still picking that over in her thoughts. She'd bitten off any suggestion he stay out of it. Thankfully, there would be trained professionals handling things, but she didn't want to hurt his pride. That only left two options, but at least she could speak to either one. The IOTC is different. It's not exactly a branch of the military. Mevere set aside the plover. The plate of biscuits was tempting her, but she weighed the explanation first. The professor teaching it works basic drills and checks things like uniforms, but mostly is teaching political education, policies, and organization. Anyone can do it. I did when I first started here. She'd meant her explanation to be comforting and frowned when he deflated further. Turning from the stove, he leaned back against the counter, rubbing his forehead. As human body language went, that wasn't good. Great, so now I'm a damned commissar. That's just perfect. I don't know what that is. Miff buried her rising distress at his reaction, and felt more than a little guilty over maundering over something as silly as redecorating. If her husband was bothered by something, she wanted him to feel able to talk to her. She tried again, gently. Why is it so upsetting? I'm not sure. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes, it's difficult to leave aside who I used to be. Tom galvanized himself, stirring the gravy listlessly. As a military officer, I swore to defend my country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and bear true faith and allegiance. We were apolitical because we were supposed to protect the government, not be the government. We thought it was wrong. Tom sighed again as he scraped the gravy into a bowl. It feels like going for a dip in a piranha pool. Don't get me wrong, it's part of the job and I'll go through the motions. But this may be the first time since I've been here that I just feel old. Useless, like I'm out of step and just haven't gone extinct yet. Tom, you are not. The girls love you. You're doing good work. You're tenured. Why would you feel useless? She felt a pang of anxiety as she took his hand to comfort him. It's just the IOTC. You'll get past it in a semester. 2 at the most. What's so terrible? It just is. And I know that's unhelpful. I didn't know if I'd make a very good teacher before I got here. But I do love it, Miv. I love teaching the girls, but I'm teaching human culture. Even marriage fundamentals was fun, in a really weird, surreal way. Tom was rubbing his chin now. The distress etched on his features, as his eyebrows drew together like storm clouds. That's nothing like teaching political orthodoxy to a bunch of interior cadets. Back on Earth, people hate and fear the interior. I just can't believe I'm mixed up in that. Mevere hung on to his hand as silence fell between them. Tom looked miserable as he sipped his coffee. While she didn't understand his aversion, at least she grasped the depth of it. Maybe if... Now there was an idea. She brightened before settling back to explore the notion, and gave his hand another squeeze, silently promising to slip out of class and call Leia. While it seemed a slim chance, it might work. Regardless, it was important to share what was going on with Tom, and she could vent a little. I can tell this is bothering you, and we will talk about it later, all right? She gave him her best smile to rally his spirits before drawing the platter of biscuits to her with gusto, making a show of it as she changed the subject. We have to get to class, and it's a full day. So, what about the priest? Well, I've left messages, but I've missed him 2 days in a row. Tom pursed his lips in thought, but his frown unknitted a bit, and he picked a biscuit apart before landing on some gravy. I need to meet him, but with everything that's happening, I'm in no hurry to feel judged. You've already been judged. You just got tenure. It felt like progress, and she smiled demurely before spreading gravy over the 4 she had waiting. Sausage gravy looked abominable, but her stomach rumbled as she dug in. You've only seen a handful of humans since we left. You should be looking forward to it. I suppose. I should probably call Hope Claassen and ask how she's doing. That sort of thing. The painters are nice folks, too. Jarma likes them. Miv snorted, despite herself. It wasn't polite, but she was too amused. That isn't exactly the glowing recommendation you think it is. So, you're my advisor. Melondi crossed her arms as she stared at Desi. What do you recommend? Not the sweater. It makes you look fat, Desi grumbled from her seat on the floor. She looked barely awake after spending 2 late nights in a row reading the files. Melondi huffed a bit, covering her unease over Desi's lethargy. Asking her to review the invasion files hadn't been fair, but she was busy dealing with Indara and Agent Duvari, and it lifted a pressing weight on her mind. Desi obliged, but even so, she hadn't expected news so close to them all. Like you can talk. Honestly, I'm taking you shopping, Melondi glowered, though she pulled the sweater off and tossed it aside. You're sure it was Letzi's mother? Lick me, princess. I grew up with tailors. I could fab some nice things, even if I couldn't. Desi yawned and stretched. For the real thing? Desi stretched a second time, and Mel stomped on a sympathy yawn as she picked out a jacket. And yes, I'm sure. None of these files are redacted. Whoever wrote this up didn't fool around, and they had full cooperation from her family. The Trolanges are military through and through. Her birth mother was a commander in naval intelligence, and it looks like she was tracked for big things before the landing. Someone like that committing suicide? They didn't want the scandal, and her co-mothers agreed. But she doesn't even know? Melondi looked herself over in the mirror and felt a dissatisfaction that had nothing to do with the jacket. She bit her lower lip as she started brushing her hair before glancing at the mirror. The family just went along with it. The family asked for it. One of her co-mothers adopted her, and they collectively sent any mention of her birth mother right to the deeps. She has to know, though, the way she's been acting. Melondi gave up on her hair. She kept it short, and going outside would make a mess of it anyway. Turning back to Desi, she held out her hands for an opinion. Desi gave a listless shrug. Uncultivated barbarian. My great-great-grandmother would have nailed your tits to the table, Melondi glowered. Please tell me she wasn't involved in target selection. Your great-great-grandmother was crazier than a barrel of eels. And no, thank the goddess, she wasn't, Desi muttered. She'd usually come up with something better, in private, but there were dark circles under her eyes and she looked exhausted. Melondi yielded the point. And you're sure about Professor Ramirez? Seriously? Even after 2 fast passes, his name was all over the preliminary documentation. I've still got a lot to look through, but I'll say one thing. The after-action sections are well written and absolutely ridiculous. The whole decision process stank of wishful thinking like last week's fish. Desi drew her knees up and wrapped her arms about them, staring dully at the wall. So what are you going to do? He's my father's only male friend beside Mr. Duvari. About Professor Ramirez? Nothing, but we need to know if Letzi is a problem before the banquet. Melondi finished, pinning her hair back and leaning down to offer Desi a hand up. Come on, let's get to breakfast. Fine. Desi hauled herself upright, stifling another yawn. If this is threat evaluation or whatever they call it, shouldn't you ask your personal deepminder, Professor Duvari? You know what she did to Lark. She's still our friend. We just don't know what's going on with her, Mel offered quietly. Besides, I couldn't if I wanted to. She's out today, so we're on our own. Lark had been uneasy for a few weeks after her identity as Kalira came out, but had never spoken of it. After a while, she seemed better. Between classes, study group, the student vlog, and Gumbri, she was still managing her reporting project, and Desi was sure it was mostly harmless. Lark was busy. She was happy. And I want it that way. I'm not going to let it happen again with Letzi. If I can. Sure, on our own. Smile for the cameras while you say that. Desi raised a hand and offered a desultory wave as they made their way into the hall. Goddess, I need tea before class. Tom watched Mavere slip out of the room, her lesson complete. She'd used the morning to sum up the First Unification War, which was fair since he'd taken so much time with the war game. An exercise to try and prove... what, exactly? He wasn't sure what lessons the girl had learned, but he'd find out today, and he'd sat through Miv's lecture in quiet apprehension, trying not to fidget. It was the middle of the week. He was rested. He had coffee. He was tenured, and he was married to 2 wonderful women with a date to set up and a palace revolution to think about. Alright, it's not a palace revolution, it's just... stuff. But it was hard to relax while being stared at. The figure of Monsignor Barcio in the upper gallery wasn't a comforting sight, though at least he wasn't alone. As much as Barcio had been looking at him, he'd also been giving furtive looks at the painters. Unexpectedly, all 3 had arrived to listen. Barcio had been first, and the painters slipped in after, exchanging ways with the twins. It wasn't like visitors were unwelcome, but he'd planned to track Barcio down, not have him appear like the Spanish Inquisition. At least everyone was on their best behavior. Semi-painter Forsyth seemed jubilant, but they always seemed to be. Sam sat quietly by, listening. The silent exchanges between the painters and the priest should have lifted his mood, but Barcio's presence was throwing him off, and he knew it. You never looked at the church after the invasion, and having it show up on your doorstep now is pissing you off. It was an unkind thought, but that didn't make it untrue. He'd dealt with his grief, maybe badly in hindsight, but he'd managed. His story wasn't that common, but it wasn't all that rare either. There was nothing about his new marriage to Miv and Leia for Barcio to approve of, and he was already braced at any remarks. How he'd gotten on with life had been his choice to make, fuck you very much. Am I angry at what he represents, or angry at myself? He already knew the answer, but felt better inside for still asking the question. Jack Smee coughed, and Tom nodded. He had a class to teach and could go wool gathering another time. He pulled up the first slide as he stood up. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. He read the words somberly, trying to lend them the weight they deserved, as he flipped to the next slide. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. Pictures of normal life at home mixed with young men drafted to war. He didn't trust himself to look back at the girls, knowing the images were painful. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Tom threw one last slide up on the wall. The desolation of no man's land yawned across the screen. The landscape shattered and blasted. He looked up at the girls then, ignoring his audience. He'd chosen the passage from A Tale of Two Cities when he'd done the lesson plan. Now the image of Desi and Mel loomed like an ominous portent. The banquet was 3 days away, and while he was outwardly calm, it was an uneasy peace. The girls were focused on the screen, distressed. Well, with Zinshiki it was hard to tell, but she was paying attention. A few looked close to tears, and it brought him back to the moment. He'd brought this conflict to them, tried to make it touch their minds, and as he saw their faces, he wondered, was I wrong? The Shulvanti Unification Wars had been no picnic. Miv's lesson spelled out that much. But, while the First World War was a good analogue, it had provided nothing. No unity, nothing affirmed. A turning point for the worse in the human psyche, and the foundation for another bloody war. The Unification Wars had ultimately done exactly that, provided unity. In stark contrast, the First World War had broken humanity's last shred of innocence in the Industrial Age. His work was to present the truth, to lay bare what happened and provide an understanding of why. He knew that academically, but it didn't make him feel any less vile. It felt like he shared a dirty secret, tarnishing himself in the telling. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. Those words were written long ago by a human named Dickens, but they always seem to renew themselves. Belle looked the most upset. She's engaged to a human, and I've just made us look like monsters. I realize things are a bit difficult this week, but you've all had the extra credit from the exercise recorded. Well done on an innovative solution, ladies. That got a few awkward smiles, at least. Before I continue, I'd like to welcome our distinguished guests. I believe you know the doctors have won this year's Imperial Science Award. Tom waited while the girls turned and smiled, particularly the twins. While decades would pass before Imperial standards were Earth's normal, the Painter Institute had become a big name everywhere. The pair had every right to be proud of internships, and he let them enjoy the moment of reflected glory. They deserved it, and besides, he didn't have anything to say about Barcio, knowing nothing of the man. I'd also like to introduce Monsignor Barcio, of the Catholic Church of Earth. He's on shield to set up relations with the other faiths. Please give them all your warmest welcome. There were whispers of welcome, but the girls turned back quickly enough. Maybe it was the awareness they were on display, and maybe it was pure imagination, but it felt like they sat straighter than usual. Get on with it, man. So, I was going to assign an essay so you could tell me what you think, but in light of everything going on, I'll settle for some good discussion today. He gave that a moment to sink in. The final banquet meeting was this afternoon, and everyone was on pins and needles. An assignment would be pointless. He looked at the notes on his omnipad. The words staring back at him were wrong. While factual, they sat on the page, stale and hollow things, devoid of the essence of the moment. He tucked the omnipad away. What you've seen, what I've been trying to teach you, is that great changes are born in pain. They come to you like a crossroads, and you have to decide how you'll meet them. Am I talking to the class or Kalira? Or both? He paused, uncertain of how to make the point he was grasping for, but determined to try. Next week, we start on the files labelled the Roaring Twenties. They were considered a good era, for the most part. The Gilded Age, and the progressive era that followed it, were ended by the war to end all wars. When I taught you about the American Civil War, I showed you how people who'd never been more than 10 miles from home suddenly gained an appreciation for the size and scope of the American nation. The First World War did the same thing on a global scale, with consequences just as profound, and as many illusions shattered. The Shulvanti Imperium is considered by some humans to be a bit stagnant in its pace of technological and social change. He let that sink in. The girls made good weather vanes for his lectures, and the expressions held nothing back when he mentioned the Imperium. Thankfully, at first they'd been too polite to interrupt. Now they knew him well enough to let him meander to his eventual point. On reflection, I believe it's because the Imperium has a vast number of worlds over a staggering area of space. Its policy to ensure a basic post-scarcity standard of living gives humans an impression of slow development, but in reality, managing uniform change on a galactic scale is a monumental undertaking. By contrast, consider the frantic pace of change I've shown you over the last few months, and it's going to accelerate. That's the basis of comparison, from some human perspectives. The girl's expression settled from studious rebellious to studious reflective, and he took the win. That was a partial reason for the war. Industrialism made its mark across Earth, but dramatic social change happened unevenly, with an evolving middle class. The powers appealed to patriotism and militarism as a solution, but while humans change quickly, it's a paradox that we don't all react well to change, and unbalanced changes can create hostility. As you've seen, all it took was a single gunshot for events to spiral out of control. While she wasn't the only one to react, he noticed Melondi blushing darkly. There's no way not to step on a landmine here. Time to get this over with. The aftermath of the war became a celebration of survival, but it wasn't a party everyone could share in. Revolution broke out in Russia, and soldiers went home, unable to find peace inside themselves. It's reflected in the art of the time, and you'll see that in the selected readings, from Hemingway and Eliot to the artists like Horton and Avery. Oh, and I have free film files for you. You can take your pick of The Great Gatsby, The Great Waldo Pepper, or The Razor's Edge. Pick one for an essay next week. If the shell isn't a disaster. Now, I'd like to get your impressions on the war, in your own words. Princess Riley Tonhair Kotesu's office. The male voice sounded older and cultured, but the overall tone was crisp and professional. Delta Rint speaking. How may I help you? Alone in the staff room, Sholea had been asking herself the same question since Mevere called. Tom was in a funk. The visit from the human priest was an issue, but probably only temporary. The prospect of teaching the IOTC class? That she could do something about. Maybe. Miv had been agitated, and it was good enough reason to make the call. Good morning. My name's Sholea Lanar Kopelavon. The princess and I are acquainted, and she offered to let me call if the need arose. She restrained a sigh. Mevere carried herself effortlessly through conversations like this, but trying to emulate her manners didn't come naturally. Still, who else could she talk to? Please hold a moment. This was already a difficult situation, and reaching out to slip was beginning to feel foolish. After all, Lady Lanar Kopelavon, thank you for waiting, but I had to look you up. The voice on the call at least sounded chipper, his crisp veneer falling away to something more personable. I'm terribly sorry. The princess is away for the foreseeable future, but she left particular instructions to provide any assistance. That's very kind of you. Sholea felt a wave of gratitude rise inside her. Slip had been a difficult student, but she tried hard with her. Her disappearance bothered her for years, but there was no disguising Slip's impish features. It had tickled her blue to see her on the news when she married. Still, Sholea expected she was long forgotten, and their chance meeting in the hospital while she fretted over Tom had been comforting. I'm sorry, this feels a bit silly. Leia huffed at herself. She wouldn't tolerate a student wasting time, and here she was. The thought of Slip's sincerity made her smile, but this wasn't something to share with strangers. Best to back out gracefully. I don't think there's anything you can do, and I apologize for wasting your time, sir. Now, lady. When we receive particular instructions, there's no service too great or too small. The male sounded like a perfect grandfather, and a trace of Leia's consternation melted away as he carried on. I can't guarantee that I can help, but I can certainly listen. I'd be very pleased if you'll allow me to try. Sholea bit her lip and shifted awkwardly in her seat. It didn't matter, since no one could see her, but she felt like one of her students, and the male on the other end of the line sounded so kind. Well, it's about my husband. Desi listened, as questions bounced from girl to girl. She tucked her hair back fretfully before reaching up. She ground her teeth over having no bangs to pull on. It might have been a habit, but she'd never noticed it till she couldn't do it. She reached up to scratch her head instead, covering her face to exchange looks with Melondi. Class had woken her up. Well, class and the tea. Sylvester Tav Blue Leaf usually kept her up all night, but she was already exhausted. Still, she could sleep tonight. This was her first good look at the painters, and she was curious to see other humans. Sammy Painter Forsyth was a complete contrast to her father, while the one named Samuel didn't seem so very different. Oh, they were smart. Very smart. Her father invited their comments when Sefer asked about medical science, and their answers were focused and intense. Keen. Desi liked what she saw. She watched as Pris raised her hand. Sir, how could the 20s be the best and worst of times? Because for some, it was a fine time to be alive. But for others, life was brutal and heartbreaking, Tom said thoughtfully, more like his usual self now. That passage I read you, to my mind, those words are as fresh and relevant now as they were when they were written. They're a promise and a warning. But sir, Pris frowned as she followed up, the audience in the back row forgotten. We live in what you call a post-scarcity society, and it is true the Imperium tries to ensure everyone has enough. Aren't things on Earth improving? That depends on what it is, and who you're asking. Desi watched her father. He seemed to be strenuously avoiding looking at the priest. Tell me, is quantity the same as quality? Desi knew the answer, as well as where he was going. She'd been raised with enough to get by, but a backwater service town and a limited future wasn't the same as living on an estate with open options. Her father knew it, and he was baiting the class. No, it isn't. Belda broke in, her hand already raised. Everyone on Willis has a great laugh there, but it's nothing like Shill. It's different, and maybe it doesn't appeal to everyone there. Welcome to the big city, Turok's girl, Pris grinned. That's just it. I don't like it here. What Shinshiki said yesterday was right. Belda frowned as she bit the words out. Everything here is great, but it's not home. And I don't mean the cities. We have cities. I'm talking about the people. What do you mean? Mel counted her head, though the question was on everyone's face. Pris is from Atherton. It's not like Shill, but it tries to be, and that's fine. But Willis doesn't. We like how we live. Bill turned to Pris. I grew up with Rakiri on my ranch, and they're good people. They have everything they need. But here, I've seen two at the academy, and they're working the grounds, not students. I've been too embarrassed to say hello. She's right. After all, I am here as an exception, not as the rule. Shinshiki spoke into the stunned silence, regarding Desala. My people come from the Alliance, and Alliance worlds are held together by pride and poverty. Pesh is one of the worst. The Alliance are little more than a pack of pirates, Desala said tartly. Poverty may make violence easy, but there's supposed to be a government, not a mob. I appreciate what you said, Shinshiki replied stoically, as she locked eyes with Desala. It validates how much I don't care. Desi glanced over at Melondi. She had a thoughtful expression, but the grip on her omnipad seemed tight. Desperate people strike out with whatever they have. Before the Alliance came to Pesh, we fought over scraps. Our culture is survival. The difference is we can be hired, but we cannot be bought. Shinshiki lifted her chin defiantly, her Rasaic taut. That is why we look down on the Rakiri. Sometimes we are too much alike. Well, and their eating habits. Like the Shill and humanity, Desi thought. We're straying off topic, but we're almost out of time, so I want to sum up for next week. Desi watched as her father stepped into the awkward silence. He still wouldn't look at the priest. The 20s were a time of contrasts, a celebration by people who were glad to be alive, but the survivors lost what many saw as blind faith in the values that sent them to war. It was a restless time, and the art and literature you'll see next week reflects that mood. They couldn't forget their sense of alienation. Couldn't let it go. Like my co-mother, Letzi said quietly. Lamana Duvari believed in being prepared. Consequently, when the officers of Duchess Eliana approved her request to interview Shinshiki's mother, she did her research. The Duchess was involved in off-world trade, though the specifics were nebulous. It wasn't surprising for an older woman with limited family, and compared to House Chelksa, her dealing seemed positively modest. Her inclination toward a security force at Pezrin was a bit eccentric. Apparently, the Natashja warband was the second she'd hired, though her records held no further details. Such curious proclivities were an internal matter, but nothing more. As she drove from the gatehouse, her perspective on the lady's security began to evolve. The sole guard was a Pezrin woman of indeterminate age, with gold and cream fur, but what caught the eye was the staggering amount of weaponry festooning her combat gear. She wasn't armored, but the weapons along her person were lethal, handy, and numerous. The quality of her gear and her bearing was sharply professional. She was alone, yet the competence in her manner suggested she was anything but. The Traveller's Guide doesn't do them justice. The first intriguing thing about the Duchess's security was his absence. The usual places for posting personal security seemed curiously empty. The second intriguing thing was the interior's overall threat assessment of the Pezrin. It set them as a close second to humans, and on par with Rakiri, so she doubted very much the guard was alone. As for the most intriguing thing, a warband was far more security than anyone should need. A sole figure stood attentively at her destination, her sable fur in stark contrast to the white blaze at her throat. From her file, Duvari recognized her as Zinshiki's birth mother. Incongruously, when her car stopped, the woman chose to open the door. "Agent Duvari." The woman blinked slowly as the tip of her tail twitched. "I am Marraket." "I owe you an apology, Professor," Letzi said quietly, folding her hands. Seated in the bottom row, she couldn't see her friends' faces, but she still felt their eyes boring holes in her all the same. She prayed they'd understand. It was the truth, and she was tired of pretending. "I mean, I don't think it was wrong, but I grew up barely remembering my co-mother. She was kind. She served a nerve, and I was told she was killed, but no one answered my questions about how. Last year, I overheard my mother and my co-mother talking. She killed herself. That's why I applied for your class. I wanted to understand. Then, when you told us about your family, I was too embarrassed to say. I'm sorry. I guess I don't know what I'm saying now or why I'm saying it." Desi was on her left this morning, and her reaction was bad enough. She could just imagine what the others were thinking, especially the princess. She couldn't look at Professor Warwick, staring at her hands as if they were the whole world, but while her stomach felt like it was sinking into the deeps, she still felt freed. Whatever the girls had to say, she'd come this far. She'd face it. Her mothers were deployed, or they never would have let her take a class with a human. Unlike her sisters, they turned her away from applying to the Blackstone. Her whole family was in the military, but her mothers kept her from joining up, like her sisters were in some kind of exclusive club, and she didn't make the cut. The odd girl out. "Carissimo Gesù, manda il tuo spirito a portarsi la tua pace infinice la amarezza, il falso senso di colpa o l'rimpianto non testicciano nei nostri cuori." "Thank you, Monsignor, but this isn't the time or the place," Warwick said sharply. "Excuse me, Professor, but Thank you, Monsignor," Warwick bit out angrily. He was looking at her, but his features, the way he stood, everything about him seemed taut to the breaking point. She'd never seen him like that, and somehow that was worse. He snapped at a priest of his own people. If she made him that angry, she probably shattered her connections with everyone. Melondi had revealed her secret based on trust, but Letzi felt her words were like a betrayal now. They weren't, but how else could they see her? People didn't talk that way to priestesses or priests. The hiss of breath she heard from Lark would have confirmed her worst fears, but something worse happened. The human priest excused himself, slipping from the gallery without a word. That was all she needed. She didn't have a right to compare herself to the professor. Her co-mother, a woman she barely remembered, had killed herself. It was a shameful burden that finally made sense of her life, but nothing like losing a spouse and a child. But what was done was done. It was her truth, and while she felt torn with regret, she wasn't sorry. "Professor, I never wanted to cause you any pain." She looked up, facing him in the eye like a lady to apologize. "I'm truly sorry for making you angry with me. Sorry that I disappointed you." Professor Warwick licked his lips and looked at her pensively. He probably didn't want to lose his temper completely, but she braced herself for the storm. What surprised her was Desala's hand on her arm, and she glanced at her. Desala nodded once, saying nothing, and watching Warwick as if nothing had happened. But her hand stayed on her arm. "Let's see, I'm not mad at you." Warwick drew a long breath, leaning back on his desk. "I'm surprised. That's a lot to unpack, and we can talk about this as much as you want, but I'm not angry with you." People didn't bark at priests. It was impious, and it wasn't Warwick's nature. She'd never seen him angry before, and wondered if he was lying to be kind. "But what you said to your priest, it was—" "Let's see, you're my student, and I care. What you shared with me and your friends, that's deeply personal." Warwick shook his head slowly, pursing his lips. "But Monsignor Barcio is from a church that doesn't think well of Shulvanti traditions, and I cut him off because I didn't want to hear it." Warwick drew in a long breath. "Truthfully, what you just saw was me acting like a Turox's ass, and I need to go and apologize." She opened her mouth, not sure what to make of it all. She was ready to face the judgment of the others, but she certainly didn't feel worth defending. She managed to say, "Oh." "I'm going to go catch up with him. Class is missed, but we'll talk any time you like. It's okay. I promise. Anyway, right now I think your friends want a word." Warwick glanced behind her and raised his eyebrows in the human way he did. "All of them." After hurrying out of the classroom, Tom got sight of the elderly priest. The black cassock stood out, and for once he was oddly thankful, since catching up to Shulvanti usually meant a brisk jog. "Monsignor Barcio," Tom called, hastening after the man. He breathed a sigh of relief as the priest stopped and turned, but the relief was short-lived. Barcio's face was inscrutable, but he folded his hands over his stomach and nodded curtly, waiting. "I owe you a big apology." Barcio regarded him with a bland mask of serenity and said nothing. Tom swallowed and pressed on. "When you got here, I wasn't ready for you." He'd gotten his wind back and found himself at a loss to explain. Justifying himself felt like pouring an ocean of emotions into a teacup. The little priest arched an eyebrow, but otherwise remained just as unreadable as before. "Look, He scrubbed a hand through his hair and glanced up and down the hall. "I'll be honest. My family was killed in the landings, and I never found any salvation that I didn't create for myself. I live on chill and just married 2 wives in a ceremony that was pagan at best, and I know the Catholic view on suicide tends to be unkind, and I'm not going to let that fall on Letzi. From your point of view, I've probably invented brand new combinations of sins, but I've worked hard to reach these girls and get them to open up. I'm sorry. It doesn't absolve me for acting like a perfect jackass, but I hope you'll accept my apology anyway." "Ognuno è responsabile della sua vita davanti a Dio." Barcio nodded sagely. "Everyone is responsible for his life before God, Professor, but we should not despair of the eternal salvation of those who take their own lives. By ways known to him alone, God provides the opportunity for repentance." He pursed his lips thoughtfully. "The act of the mother is not the act of the child, but you have a reputation for defending your children rather forcefully. A good shepherd sometimes takes risks, and I won't blame you for defending your flock." Barcio shrugged and offered him an impish smile. "I accept your apology, my son. After all, absolution is my business." Tom exhaled and smiled. "Christ, that's a relief." "Professor, you just said the secret word." Barcio beamed before studying him acutely. 2 wives? 2 wives. Tom felt his teeth want to grind, but he nodded, bracing himself. "And maybe a girlfriend, Monsignor." "Call me Friar." Barcio shook his head briefly. "C'è coragissimo nuovo modo. Are you sure you're not Italian?"